Welcome to my show. I'm a guest here. His name is John Pabon. Mr. John, how are you doing, sir?
I'm well, thank you.
All right. Firstly, you are an author. You are also a consultant and probably a former UN advisor. Can you please, Mr. John, discuss more about yourself and how you are doing currently now, Mr. John?
Absolutely. So I did start my career at the United Nations and was there for several years, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. But over the course of my career, I've gotten into the world of sustainability. So I spend a lot of my time helping primarily large organizations, big companies to improve the things they do, looking at their strategies, looking at how they treat their people, their employees, their workers, as well as how they communicate all the things they do. When I'm not doing that, I'm doing a lot of writing. So I have a few books that I have written, and I'm working on a third book now. And when I'm not doing that, I spend a bit of time on social media helping educate people about the world of sustainability and international politics.
Yes, I'm so glad that you're doing now. You're writing more books and you're also doing a lot to impact the people outside there. Thank you so much for that, Mr. John. And I also like to dive to the point of the book you've written. I do not know, maybe this is the only book you've written, or I think you said you've written about three books. So can you please discuss more on the sustainability for the rest of us and also the other book you've written? And are you also planning on more books in the future, Mr. John?
Sure, absolutely. So, Sustainability for the Rest of Us was my first book, and it is I think of it as a practical guide for people to better understand the world of sustainability, what it is, but also what they can do. What I don't do is I don't tell people exactly what they should be doing. I think people can figure that out for themselves, but the book helps them to hopefully think about the world of sustainability and making the planet and humanity a better place, thinking about it a little bit differently. My second book, which came out last year, is called The Great Greenwashing, and that looks at the communications around sustainability. So, how companies, how governments and politicians, how celebrities talk about being good for the planet, good for people, eco-friendly, green, when in reality, maybe they aren't as good as they say they are. And my third book, which will come out later this year, looks at the ultra wealthy around the world and how they position themselves as being good for the planet and good for people, and whether or not they're telling the truth.
Those three books are really, really lovely. The second one deals with, speaking, people thinking they are helping, and also the first book, which also imparts one or two things to the fellow listeners. Thank you so much, Mr. John. And I also like to dive to the point of the United Nations. United Nations is something people used to listen to. They used to hear it's United Nations, but a lot of people probably do not really know what their role is. They just used to see, like me myself, I just used to watch the news and I'll just see you and I'll just see the country sitting down. I do not know what function they are. So I would like to ask, what do you think are the primary role of United Nations in global governance, Mr. John?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the United Nations started right after World War II, and it had a very specific purpose, and that was essentially to keep the world at peace. We had just come out of two massive wars in a very short span of time, so the purpose of that organization was to just make sure everybody was kind of in the same room together, talking through problems instead of fighting over those issues. But over the past, how many years has it been? 70, 80 years? It's evolved quite a bit. So it's not only a peacekeeping type of an organization, it also sets regulations through some of its bodies. It endows money to places that need money. It has a bunch of different peacekeeping operations around the world. It also has a bunch of different agencies and organizations that focus on very specific things like cultural heritage or workers' rights or indigenous affairs. So, very specific things. Nuclear disarmament is a big one. So, the organization has evolved very much in the past 70, 80 years. And to your question, what is its role in global governance? That's an interesting one because I'm not sure the UN even knows what its role in global governance is right now because it has grown so much. It's trying to do everything. And I think ideally what it should be doing or what people should when they see or think of the UN, what they should think of is, okay, the purpose of this organization is just to keep global peace. And in that respect, it's done an amazing job. We are, even though the news may not make it seem like it, we're at the pretty much the safest period in human history right now for most people, not for everybody, but for most people internationally. So the UN's done a good job on that respect. All the other stuff that it has evolved along with the organization, that's where it might not be doing the best job sometimes, but I also am a big proponent of the United Nations, and I feel that we're in a much better place now with them than we would have been if the United Nations was never formed.
Completely agree. Even probably there will be more wars that we might not know that could have, evolved if they were not put into place. It has really, really helped the world in a very, very large way. Thank you so much for that insight, Mr. John. And I also like to dive to the impact that's done in international law, laws that have been brought to that affect every single one of us today, and also human rights. We used to see human rights activists and stuff like that. What impact do you see the United Nations has had on human rights and also the international laws today, Mr. John?
Absolutely. So if we look at it just from the past, let's say 15 or 20 years, when it comes to the UN's impact globally on kind of on everybody, I think the biggest pieces of work that it's done have been the Sustainable Development Goals today, but before them, the Millennium Development Goals, which were broad sets of goals that tried to help a lot of things like human rights, literacy rates, infant mortality. Today, with the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of that is focused on the environment and workers and making companies better corporate citizens as well. And with all of that, the UN has, of course, not been perfect. Nothing the organization has ever done has been perfect, but they've helped to push and really improve things for the planet and for people. When it comes to international labor law and human rights law, the UN also has a really big role that they've played through a couple different organizations. When we look at labor law, the International Labor Organization, which is part of the United Nations, has done a lot of work, particularly in the developing world, to help out where maybe those individual governments might not have the mechanisms to be able to do so. I did a piece of work with the International Labor Organization many years ago, now in Borneo, looking at migrant labor from Indonesia into Malaysia and trying to make sure that everybody was treated appropriately, paid the right wages, and were not brought over without the right regulations and the right processes. And a great piece of work. And that's just a small example of what the ILO and the UN is doing at a global level. That's just one tiny example out of probably thousands of similar projects going on around the world at the same time.
We hope this project continues to evolve so that every single person will be treated appropriately and every single person will be given what they actually deserve. Thank you so much for that insight, Mr. John. And I also like to dive to the point of private sector, non-governmental organization, and also struggling nations. We do know that there are a lot of countries all over the world, some countries that are struggling when it comes to probably economic development and stuff like that. How do you think the UN also, try their best to support this economic development that are struggling? And how do you think the United Nations also work with the private sectors and also the non-governmental organization, Mr. John?
It's an interesting question and an interesting sort of dilemma for the people that run the United Nations because the number one rule at the United Nations that no country, no United Nations can go against is the idea of territorial integrity. And what that means is that every country is its own sovereign country. The UN can't unilaterally go into a country and do anything. They have to be invited in by that country. The UN can't create laws that dictate things to a particular country. They can't fight a war in a particular country. So the wars and the strife that we see today, a lot of that is internal to a country. It's civil war, civil strife that the UN cannot get involved in. It's sort of rule number one. And the reason I bring that up is because when it comes to things like economic development, helping countries that might be struggling economically or otherwise, the UN can't just go in and help. There has to be a real big reason for them to do so. And the reason is typically that the economic struggle has spilled over a border or it's impacting countries outside of the original country. And then the UN can get involved. So they have to balance that out a lot. And they've done a very good job over the past 80 years of doing so. So if we look at sort of conflicts that have evolved, Korea in the 1960s is a great example of the UN going in and trying to calm down a massive issue. If you look at cases like the genocide in Rwanda or in Darfur more recently, those are also cases where the UN was able to go in and assist with economic or civil strife. Again, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'm sure there are people listening to this saying, oh, those are terrible examples and terrible things happen. And yeah, absolutely they did, but probably a lot better than what would have happened if the UN didn't get involved in the first place. To your second question around NGOs, non-governmental organizations working with the UN, the UN's always been a big proponent of what they call public-private partnerships, which is just a fancy way of getting companies to work with NGOs to do something good. So the UN's always done that because the UN, for most of its history, has not had a lot of money to do a lot of things. So the fact it can get anything done at all is pretty amazing, given its budget is so tight. So to supplement that, they work a lot with the private sector companies and they work a lot with NGOs to try to help them push their agenda forward.
What you said currently now is very, very lovely. So they are more of the international side. Is when something is impacting others,